So I was recently asked a question, how can you respond to a Muslim who uses Matthew 12:40 as proof that Jesus didn't die on the cross? Now, in order to answer this question, you have to first realize that Muslims believe the Quran teaches that Jesus didn't die. And so therefore they look for ways, even in the Gospels, to try to show that this is the case, because they believe that the Gospel is a divine revelation from Allah. Now, Matthew 12:40 specifically is the story where some of the Pharisees come to Jesus and say to him, hey, give us a sign, give us some proof, okay, that you are who you claim to be. And Jesus responds by saying, look, I will give you no sign except for the sign of Jonah. For just as Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights, so the Son of Man will also be in the earth for 3 days and 3 nights. And so the Muslim says, look, did Jonah die when he was in the belly of the fish? And of course the answer is no. And they say, well, see, look, Jesus is saying, just like Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights and didn't die, so the Son of Man will also be in the earth for 3 days and 3 nights, and he also will not die. And so they're using this as an argument to prove that Jesus actually didn't die, or at least they're making this as an argument that the Gospels teach that Jesus didn't die. Now, the first problem with this approach is that you have to realize that in an analogy, which is what Jesus is doing here, is talking about him being like Jonah. When you compare two things in an analogy, the goal is not to show that everything between one thing and the other thing is supposed to be identical. Okay? Now, of course, I actually believe that what Jesus is saying is that he will also be in the earth or dead for 3 days, just like Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days, not that he also will die. But it's important to realize that in an analogy, that's not necessarily the case, that everything that happens that is true of one person is also going to be true of the other person in an analogy. Some things aren't going to carry over, and that's okay, because that's how an analogy works. Second of all, if the Muslim's going to listen to what the Gospel of Matthew says in chapter 12, then perhaps they should also jump 4 chapters later in Matthew chapter 16 and see that Jesus, in talking to his disciples, says, the Son of Man, I have to go to Jerusalem and suffer and be killed, and on the 3rd day I'll rise again. So Jesus, in that chapter, predicts his death and his resurrection. So of course, that's in no uncertain terms. Jesus makes that plainly clear. Furthermore, in chapter 27 of Matthew, we see that Jesus is actually crucified. And the Romans were really good at crucifixion. They didn't fail often at killing people. And so we know that Jesus also died because Matthew 27 teaches that. And so if the Muslim cares about what Matthew 12 says, they should also consider what Matthew 27 says. In fact, Jesus even says while he's hanging on the cross, Lord, into your hands I commit my spirit. And he lets out a large cry and he dies. So it's pretty obvious that happened. And then in chapter 28, when people come to the tomb and witness that the tomb is empty, an angel appears and says, why are you looking for Jesus here? He has risen from the dead. Okay, so again, you can't rise from the dead unless you died in the first place. So again, I would just say to the Muslim who says that Matthew chapter 12 and the whole story about the sign of Jonah makes a case that Jesus didn't die, that in these other parts of Matthew, we have clear, even more decisive evidence that Jesus did die. He predicts his death, he actually dies, and then the angel even affirms that he rose from the dead. And of course, this is nothing to say of the other Gospels, which also affirm that, and of course, Jewish and Roman historians like Tacitus and Josephus, who also affirm that Jesus died by crucifixion. So we have plenty of reason to think that Jesus did actually die.